too deep into this. All right, so I would like to say hello to everybody. Thank you for coming to our Casca Canvas Talks, where we showcase the work of Canadian postdocs and Canadian postdocs abroad. So I would like to introduce Dr. Nicole Drakos. Nicole Drakos is a NSERC postdoctoral fellow in the Computational Astrophysics Research Group at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She obtained her PhD from the University of Waterloo in 2019, where she studied dark matter halo evolution. Her main research interests are using theoretical and computational models of structure formation to study cosmology and galaxy evolution. Sounds like an extremely interesting talk. And occasionally her friend Micah the cat might show up. Let's see. And so since we are meeting virtually, I would like to acknowledge the land on which we gather virtually with Dr. Drakos is the unceded territory of the Awawa speaking Yupi tribe, the Ama Mutsun, a tribal band comprised of descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. So now that we have that, Nicole, would you like to take it away?
Thank you, Leo, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming today. So as Leo said, I moved to California about 2 years ago. So it's great to get a chance to talk about my research to the Canadian astronomy community. And mainly I work on theory and computation, trying to understand how structure forms in the universe. And I'm particularly interested in places where theory and observations don't quite match up, since those are places where we can really learn more about the universe. So here is an outline of my talk. I'm going to begin by talking about the evolution of structure, and then I'm going to talk about some specific research projects from small dwarf galaxy scales all the way up to galaxy cluster scales. So there's imprints of structure formation from satellites in the Milky Way up to how galaxies are distributed on the sky, all the way to fluctuations in the CMB. And all of those can be described fairly well using the lambda-CDM model. So the lambda-CDM model has 3 key ingredients: dark energy in the form of a cosmological constant, cold dark matter, and a little bit of baryons, which make up the stars and planets. And this model only has 6 parameters. So here's a set of 6 possible parameters: the amount of baryons, the amount of dark matter, the size and scale dependence of the fluctuations, the age of the universe, and the epoch of first star formation. So here is a schematic of how the universe evolved. It started off nearly 14 billion years ago, the Big Bang. The universe is very hot and dense, and as it expanded, it cooled, and protons and electrons could combine together to form neutral hydrogen, which gives us the first snapshot of the universe at the time of the CMB. And then after this, we entered into the dark ages. During this time, structure is still forming, though. Dark matter was collapsing down to form dark matter halos and sheets and filaments, and gas could fall into the gravitational potential wells, and eventually the first stars turned on, and then the first galaxies. And then we entered into the next kind of transition phase of the universe, and that's reionization. And this is where radiation let off by the galaxies began to ionize the gas and turned it from being neutral back to being ionized. And then we entered into the current phase of the universe, which is the galaxy-dominated era. So I use simulations to understand how structure forms. This is a dark matter simulation, and it starts off at the beginning with the density being pretty uniform, but then regions with slight overdensities collapse down to form structures, and you end up with all these bright little knots. So these are dark matter halos, and it's inside of these that galaxies form. So here's a snapshot from a simulation showing the dark matter distribution. And if you look for all the dark matter halos, you can assume that galaxies live in each of these dark matter halos. And this does a pretty good job explaining things on the large scale. So whatever theory we have in place to describe the universe, it has to look a lot like lambda-CDM on large scales. But on small scales, there are some tensions between simulations and observations, which could indicate a problem with lambda CDM. So I'm going to start off by talking about the small scale structure. So if we go back to this snapshot from the simulation, and if you zoom in, all these green dots here are dark matter halos that are the right mass to host dwarf galaxies. This is a few images of dwarf galaxies in the universe. So they range in masses from 10 to the 9 solar masses down to 10 to the 3. And these dwarf galaxies should exist within subhalos. So these are halos that are inside larger halos. And as I mentioned, there's different potential problems on these small scales with a lot of very catchy names, such as the missing satellites problem, too big to fail, and the core cusp problem. But overall, to answer these, there's two main questions. There's what is the abundance of subhalos? And then how is the mass distributed within them? And one reason why this matters is it is possibly one of the best places to test for the nature of dark matter. So these are dark matter simulations showing different models of dark matter. On the left, this is cold dark matter, which is the leading theory. And in the middle, this is warm dark matter. So warm dark matter are particles that have slightly higher energies. So they end up washing out the small scale structure. So they disrupt all the little subhalos. So you get a lot less of those. And then there's self-interacting dark matter, in which you don't necessarily get less subhalos, but interactions in the center of the halos will make the cores less dense. So you can see it's a little hard to tell in this picture, but by eye, but here in the center in the self-interacting matter, it's a little bit more diffuse than the cold dark matter model. Another way that you can test for the nature of dark matter is through a dark matter annihilation signal. So dark matter annihilation is where a dark matter particle is its own antiparticle. So if they collide together, they'll annihilate and let off a signal. And since the number of these collisions depend on how dense the dark matter is, it really matters whether you're in a scenario like this, where you have a lot of these tiny little dense subhalos, or one of these other situations. And there's two main ways to study substructure evolution in the universe. On the left here, we have cosmological simulations like the one I showed earlier. And then on the right, shown a snapshot from an isolated simulation. So in isolated simulations, you take particles to represent a subhalo, you throw it into a background potential, and you let it evolve, and then track that individual subhalo. And both of these approaches have pros and cons. Cosmological simulations, you can get the full complexity of what's going on. You can get statistical properties of subhalos, but they're also hard to interpret because there's a lot happening, and you get resolution problems on small scales. In isolated simulations, you can look at specific individual processes, and you can track individual halos, but you have to put in a lot of assumptions to set up the simulation, and then they tend to be much more simplistic. So the way that subhalos evolve is mainly through tidal stripping. So this is showing an isolated simulation of a subhalo merging into a larger host halo. And as it orbits around, material gets tidally stripped off, and you end up with these streams of matter. And these kinds of simulations have given a few general results. So this animation showing here on the left, this is a subhalo evolving. The black particles are the bound subhalo particles, and the blue is the material that's been stripped off. In the middle is the density profile. So this is showing the density as a function of radius. It starts off with this characteristic shape here with the dashed line. And as time goes on, material mostly gets removed from high radius, but then you also get a drop in central density. And then the bound mass of the satellite has this step-like pattern where every time it passes through pericenter, a large amount of material gets stripped off, and there's a large drop in the mass, and then it continues on. Another thing that's been found is that the way that particles get removed are mainly based on their energy. So this plot here is showing phase space of all these particles in the simulation based on their angular momentum on the x-axis and how their binding energy on the x-axis. And you can see after the first orbit, all the particles with energies less than about 0.25 about 0.25 get removed. After the third orbit, it strips down to about 0.5 and so on. So it really seems to be this outside in process and energy space, which is a bit different than the traditional picture where you remove things outside of a tidal radius. So based on this, in collaboration with James Taylor at the University of Waterloo and Andrew Benson at Carnegie, we developed an energy truncation model to try to describe how subhalos evolve. And the basic picture is that you just do that stripping in energy space. So we came up with a model to describe that. And this is the way that the profile would evolve. So the black line is the initial density profile, if it's an NFW profile, and then the different colored lines are stripping down to higher and higher energies in energy space. And you can see we mostly lose particles at large radii, and you do get a drop in the central density, but then as you go out to very, very small radii, it converges to the density of the original profile. We also combine this with a mass loss model. So this is a pretty typical equation that's used to describe mass loss. And basically, if you know the density of the host system, you can calculate a tidal radius. So we use this equation to find a tidal radius, remove the mass outside of that, and then recalculate what the density profile should be based on that mass. And then the next time the satellite orbits around, we do the same thing. And then we're able to reproduce really well what simulations show. So what's exciting about this model is that, first of all, it's 0 parameters. It hasn't been calibrated to simulations at all. We use simulations to test how well it worked, but we didn't do any fitting or calibrations to it. So this means that it's predictive. We can use it to make predictions about how subhalos evolve outside of the region of parameter space that the simulations test. So here are just some plots showing how well our model works at capturing simulation results. So this is showing the density profile evolution. The black line is the NFW profile that the simulation starts out with. And then these black dots here are the simulation after a couple orbits. And the blue, orange, and green lines are different models used in the literature. So these are all just fits to isolated simulations. And then the purple line is our energy truncation model. And they all do quite a good job at capturing the trends. In general, our model seems to do a little bit better than the Hayashi model, maybe a little bit worse than these more updated models for the same simulations, but they all do a very good job. With our mass loss model, we're able to reproduce the mass loss trends really well. So again, this purple line is our model, and the blue, green, and orange are other models in the literature, and we're comparing it to the simulation results in yellow. And one kind of exciting thing that can come out of our model is that we're not restricted to just NFW profiles. So these are a few different models. So for those that know, it's an NFW profile, Hernquist profile, Einasta profiles, and King models. So what's important here is that starting off with different models, we're still able to predict how the profile will evolve. Even in cases like this King profile, where the central density is pretty flat, we reproduce that drop in central density. So just to summarize, our model has 0 free parameters. It's physically based. It does a very good job of describing these isolated simulations, and it can be universal. And so, and as I said before, these things means that our model can be predictive. So one thing that we were interested in is, what is the central density of subhalos? So artificial mass loss, and is particularly at the center of halos, becomes a problem at very small masses. So we wanted to know what our model predicts in these regions where simulations do have these numerical problems. So here is a plot showing density profiles for, again, our model in purple, and then these 3 other parameterizations. And for high mass fractions, they're really very similar, but then by the time you get down to a mass fraction of 0.01. Our model here in purple has quite a higher central density than the other models. And what we think this is it's because these other models are being fit to simulations. And this is at these very small mass ratios, they're kind of an extrapolation beyond what the simulations can capture. So we wanted to see what this means for the dark matter annihilation rate. So the annihilation rate is shown here. This factor in the front depends on the dark matter particle properties. And then the second factor, sometimes known as the J factor, and that has to do with how dense the dark matter particles are. And it's also common to use a boost factor, which is a dimensionless quantity. And so if you write the annihilation rate in terms of the boost factor, you can break it up into this term in the beginning that has to do with the dark matter particle properties, this term which has to do with halo mass and size, and then the boost factor, which has to do with the clumpiness of the profile. So when we compared our model, so that's the NFW profile truncated to different masses. For ST, the dashed line, that's a sharp truncation, where there's just a sharp truncation in the NFW profile, and then the Hayashi fit. So we chose those two models because they're very commonly used in the literature. We got quite a wide range of predictions for both the J factor and the boost factor. So this is something that we've been looking into and trying to figure out how much this could affect predictions of dark matter annihilation. So just to summarize what I've said about these dwarf galaxy scales, small scale structures are probably the hardest thing to get right in simulations, but they might be the best place to study the nature of dark matter. And in particular, there's this advantage to using physically based models because they can make predictions beyond the range of simulations. And one of the kind of key questions is what is happening with the central density of dark matter halos. But the problems are in cosmological simulations, resolution becomes a problem and you can't resolve them. In isolated simulations, you have to assume an initial profile, and that basically means assuming a central density because you end up extrapolating that profile to very small radii. And then, of course, baryons matter. So this is a question which I'm very interested in trying to answer, and I think it's very important to get correct to make proper constraints with things like dark matter annihilation. Okay. So now I'm going to move up to galaxy scales. So if we go back to our simulation picture here, where all the halos are colored in magenta, these tend to agree very well with the way that galaxies are distributed in the universe. And for this reason, the lambda CDM model and these kind of dark matter simulations are the backbone for most galaxy formation models. So here's a summary to the way that you can connect between the dark matter simulation picture and observations of galaxies on the sky. So this is from a Risa Wexler and Jeremy Tinker review that goes through the galaxy halo connection. And it summarizes different ways that you can model this. And on the left here, we have physical models. So things like hydrodynamical simulations that really try to get exactly physically what's happening as galaxies form. So these have a lot of advantages. They really help figure out what is actually happening physically, and they are more predictive since they're based on physics. But in practice, when, for example, trying to replicate things we see in the universe, right now hydrodynamical simulations aren't quite there yet. They're very computationally costly, and they depend a lot on things like subgrid modeling. So things like subhalo abundance matching and halo occupation models are more useful for certain applications. So these are things where you look at what the distribution of objects should be on the sky, and then draw from probability distributions and try to match what you see. So I'm going to specifically talk about using this kind of modeling to make synthetic galaxy catalogs. So synthetic galaxy catalogs are exactly what they sound like. They try to make predictions of what a galaxy survey will detect. And they're important for, first of all, preparing for surveys, helping to design them, predicting what they can see and what kind of science questions they can answer, and then also for analyzing simulations. And then there's this feedback where you're always trying to simulate galaxy catalogs that are kind of the next generation of observations, so they go beyond observational knowledge. And then you use the updated observations to then inform your modeling and try to converge on a picture of what is happening in galaxy formation. So this is a plot put together by Brant Robertson showing some of the observational facilities that will come out over the next decade. So I'm going to particularly talk about the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope and the James Webb Telescope. And both of these telescopes will probe back out to the epoch of reionization. So I'm not going to talk too much about reionization in this talk, but this is the time, the transition period in the universe where hydrogen went from being neutral back to ionized. And it's a very unconstrained period in the history of the universe just because it is out at such high redshifts. So there's a lot of open questions about the sources for reionization and the timeline, as well as the topology on the sky. So one interesting thing about these high redshift galaxy surveys that are coming up is they're going to really probe very large areas on the sky. So this is just showing the effective area of a few surveys. So this is so this background image is 1 degree squared on the sky. This is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field here in blue, and that's the deepest image that we have of the sky right now. JWST will have quite a few surveys that look out to the epochs of reionization. So here I've shown JADES, which is shown in red. So in the center, this is the effective area that will be at the same depth as the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. And then the dotted line is the area that it'll probe at not quite as high of a depth, but still into the epoch of reionization. And then there's also Cosmos Webb here shown in orange, which again goes about as deep as this medium deep part in JADES, and will tell us a lot about the epoch of reionization. And then after James Webb comes out, Roman will come out hopefully. And this is over top. I've just plotted the field of view of one pointing with the Roman telescope. So it'll be able to get areas at least this large and probe out to depths of the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. So and then with the next generation of telescopes, we're going to get this high redshift data that covers much larger areas on the sky. And one reason this is really exciting is you can look at environments around individual galaxies. And so I've been working on some of the preparation work for this by trying to simulate what galaxy surveys will look like at these high redshifts on large areas of the sky. This is another plot demonstrating just how huge of a field of view Roman has. So in the center, this is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, and there's a couple of zoom in showing the amount of structure that it will see. In white, these are the wider HST observations around it. And then the background are ground-based observations. And then in orange here, this is the Roman Wide Field Instrument, which is, again, just a really enormous field of view on the sky. So I'm going to talk about the deep realistic extragalactic model galaxy catalogs. So this is something that I've been working on for the past couple of years, and it came out on arXiv last week. And there's really a team of a team of really fantastic people on it. In particular, I wanted to highlight Bruno Villaseñor, who did a lot of the images, the synthetic images, and then Brant Robertson, who leads this group of people. And our main goals were to provide the community with a synthetic data set for these wide, deep galaxy surveys, and then also specifically to look at what the science returns of a 1 degree squared Roman Ultra Deep Field would be. So to create synthetic data like this, the method we used abundance matching. So this is where you take your dark matter simulations, you find all the halos, and you put galaxies in them. And then since simulations give you these snapshots in time, you need to relate them to what you actually see where you look back in space for things further away or from earlier times. So we built what's called a light cone. So this is showing the galaxy, the mass density of galaxies on the sky. So if you're right here at 0, 0 and you're looking out into space, this is what you would see with the 1 degree survey. And since it's so deep, I had to stack this. So there's it's been stacked 6 times, but as you go out to redshift 10 or so, you can see, even though this is a very large area in the sky for a deep survey, it's still just a very narrow, almost pencil beam. And then we assign morphologies to each galaxy. So we just assumed their Cirsic profiles, and we gave them shapes and sizes and angles on the sky. And then we did some spectra modeling. So using FSPS, we assign spectra to each galaxy. This is showing spectra for a star-forming galaxy on the top and a quiescent galaxy at the bottom. And this is mostly just an advertisement for the Dream Galaxy catalogs. They contain positions, masses, star formation rates, morphologies, photometry for both Roman and GWST, all the spectral parameters that went into the modeling, the dark matter halo properties, etc. And we spent a lot of time making sure that we reproduced a lot of known observational trends, including things like the halo mass function, stellar mass function, luminosity functions, the cosmic star formation rate, density, etc. And then we also made a synthetic image. So this is showing 1 degree on the sky of all the galaxies we simulated. And you can really see there's just this enormous amount of data that's going to come out, and it's going to be so densely populated with galaxies out to very high redshifts. So on galaxy scales, dark matter simulations are the backbone of galaxy formation models. Synthetic galaxy catalogs are especially important to get right because we need them to prepare and analyze future galaxy surveys. In particular, I talked about some upcoming surveys which will show very wide and deep areas on the sky. And then we created the Dream synthetic galaxy catalogs to represent this regime in observations. Okay. So far, I have talked about dwarf galaxy scales where simulations and observations don't necessarily agree very well, but we might be able to use that to test for different models of dark matter. And then I talked about modeling observations on galaxy scales, and now I'm going to talk about galaxy clusters. So if we go back to this snapshot that I've been showing throughout the talk, galaxy clusters, there's only 2 in this snapshot here. So these are on scales of 10 to the 14, 10 to the 15 solar masses in these halos. And they are commonly used for a variety of different studies. And one thing that they're used for is constraining cosmology. So cluster abundances, so the number of galaxy clusters on the sky, they constrain this combination of parameters, the sigma 8. So this has to do with the size of fluctuations, where a high sigma 8 means there's very high density contrast, and then omega matter, so the amount of matter in the universe. And overall, so they would look something like this in parameter space, where for a certain number of clusters, you'll know you lie on this banana, where you could either have high fluctuations and lower amounts of matter, or you could have smaller fluctuations but more matter. And one kind of interesting thing about doing measurements of these parameters is there is this growing tension in the parameter sigma 8. And this tension is between early measurements of the CMB and late time measurements, so using things like lensing, cluster count, and redshift space distortions. This plot's showing that degeneracy. So here in yellow, red, and blue, these are the late time measurements, and then in green is the Planck measurement. And these late time measurements, I believe, are all using lensing. But you end up with this tension where Planck's kind of predicting these slightly higher values of sigma 8. And so this tension could be, it could be that there is just some systematic problem with the way that these numbers are calculated, and it will go away with more with more careful modeling. It could be that that's not really that statistically significant and it'll go away with more data. Or it could be that there is a problem with the underlying model and our understanding of limp CM is a little bit too simplistic and there's something more going on. So this is a project that's led by James Taylor and Yuba Mora at the University of Waterloo. James likes to call it splitting the banana. And the idea is that as you move up this banana diagram, there's actually this difference where if you're up here, halos would have formed earlier. So the idea is that if you can measure halo ages, that will break the degeneracy. So this might be an independent test that will allow you to constrain sigma 8. So this you can measure halo ages through their structural properties. So for example, different halo structure properties include concentration, which is the outer radius divided by the inner radius. So things that are more concentrated, more of their mass is in the center. There's shape, so how spherical a halo is. And then there's substructure, which I talked a little bit about earlier, where it's the amount of subhalos within a halo. And as you increase in age, halos on average are rounder, they're more concentrated, and they have less substructure. So if you go up this banana, you'd expect that if you live in a universe up here, on average halos will look like this, where if you're down here, halos will look more like this. So there's, a lot of different details you can use to sort this out. The cosmological parameters are going to change the formation history. So the amount of matter halos accrete in when and the mergers they go through. This in turn will influence halo properties, and halo properties are going to be connected to the measurable galaxy cluster properties. And so ideally, to use this as a test, you could go from galaxy cluster properties back to cosmology. So Yuba recently put out a paper really detailing how formation history depends on cosmology. And he has some calculations about how halo age depends on cosmological parameters. So here, this is halo age, and it's measured as Z50. So this is the redshift in which the halo builds up 50% of its mass. And these contours here show different ages, where things up here in red are older and things down here in blue are younger. And then, as we said earlier, these halo ages, constant halo ages are going to be orthogonal to cluster counts. So by combining these two things, we might be able to get much better constraints on things like sigma 8 and omega matter. And in this paper, Yuba kind of goes through some different arguments and kind of roughly details out how Euclid might be able to make these constraints. So it's really important to kind of figure out how to do this before data starts coming out from these upcoming telescopes. And so we really need a robust way to measure cluster ages and relate it back to the underlying cosmology. I also have done a bit of work in the past looking at how formation history influences halo properties. So this is some work I did during my PhD, running simulations of one-to-one mergers and halos. And one thing we found is that it seems to be that you can predict really well, given halo A and halo B and what their orbit is. You can predict really well what the final halo will be based on just two parameters. And these two parameters are the spin parameter. So this is a commonly used dimensionless parameter to characterize the angular momentum in a halo. And then the relative energy parameter, which is a parameter that describes the energy of the final system compared to the initial system, and then scaled by this mass factor to account for the fact that the mass is doubling in these one-to-one mergers. And you can calculate these completely just based on the initial conditions if you use some arguments for energy and angular momentum conservation. So this is showing some of our results from that study. This is looking at axis ratios and halos. So C over A, which is the smallest axis compared to the largest, and C over B, which is the smallest axis compared to the medium-sized axis. And in the first case, it scales with this energy parameter. So the way you can think of that is if you have a more energetic sort of orbit, you have the particles get spread out over a larger area, but then it also depends on spin. So since this depends on the angular momentum of the orbit, if you have a bit of angular momentum, you're spreading particles out in that second axis. And the density profile seems to depend almost completely on kappa, the relative energy profile. So this is showing the dashed line is the initial profile. The dotted line is what you would expect it to look like if you just scaled it up by a factor of 2 in mass. And then these colored lines are the different simulation results. So in blue here, these have lower relative energy parameters, and they tend to be a little bit more extended. And then these, in red, these higher kappa parameters, which have more potential energy, are more condensed. So this kind of straightforward mapping that we saw in the simplest case indicates that we might be able to build up pretty clear models if we would just want to start from individual mergers and map out a merger tree and try to figure out what the final properties of a halo should be. Overall, with upcoming data, for example, from Euclid, we should be able to measure cluster properties and use them to actually constrain cosmology. I showed some, initial work kind of hinting at this, both Yuba's work, which really looked into how dark matter halo age is how to calculate that, and then how that constraint is orthogonal to cluster counts. And then I showed some results where I looked at individual mergers and showed halo properties do link very, very clearly to the formation history, in particular mergers of halos. But overall, there's a lot of work to be done to map out the connection between galaxy cluster observable and cosmological parameters, so that when measurements do start coming out in the next couple of years for hundreds of thousands of clusters about their different properties, that we can use that to actually place a constraint on cosmology. So here is a kind of overall summary. I talked about dark matter halo simulations, in particular, how they can be used to study the nature of dark matter, create synthetic data sets, and constrain cosmological parameters. On dwarf galaxy scales, that's where there's the worst agreement between lambda CDM and observations, but the subhalos on these scales might be the best place to study the nature of dark matter. Particularly, I emphasize the need of predictive models so that you can go beyond the regimes that are hard to resolve in simulations. And then the specific question of what is happening to the central density and why that matters for dark matter annihilation calculations. On galaxy scales, dark matter simulations are often used to model galaxy formation, to do things like create synthetic data to prepare for future surveys. And one regime that I'm interested in is that of wide and deep surveys that will look at galaxies during the epoch of reionization. And then on galaxy cluster scales, galaxy clusters are often used to constrain cosmological parameters through cluster counts. There is this known tension in sigma 8 measurements that could potentially indicate new physics. And one way to get an additional constraint on these parameters is using upcoming data, such as halo, using upcoming data from halo structural properties. And now is really the time to kind of map out what that connection is between cluster observables and cosmological parameters. Right. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Nicole. So are there any questions for our speaker? I see William Wall has their hand up, so please feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, hello.
Hello.
Do the models, you talk about clumping, using your models, you can reproduce clumping or with the models and observations of what you can see. Can you constrain how often the dark matter particles would collide with each other and therefore produce photons? Could you thereby rule out certain models of what dark matter particles are based on what you've done?
Yeah, so the number of collisions depends a lot on the density. So that would depend on both the density profiles of the individual subhalos, but then also how they're distributed. So we were just looking at individual subhalos and how they evolved. But one thing I am interested in doing in the future is combining those with predictions for the distribution of subhalos and making actual predictions about what the dark matter annihilation constraint should be, with assuming that there is that conserved central density and seeing how much of a difference that could make.
So that's
doable, but haven't done it yet.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, Julio Navarro, please ask your question.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the talk, Nicole. It was a whirlwind of things. I guess I have a bunch of questions about each of them, but I'll restrict myself to one. Bringing you back towards the beginning of your talk, we talked about tidal stripping and stuff like that. Something I've been interested in the recent past. What do your models predict that for, say, an NFW like halo, there should always be a bound remnant, or do the models predict that there is always continuous mass loss until the whole halo disrupts in a particular orbit? I guess I read your paper a couple of times and it wasn't clear to me if you want to extrapolate towards very long times, what happens.
Yes, but there's a caveat there. So since as you extrapolate the NFW profile to very small radii, it diverges to an infinite density at the central. So you're always going to have something that's bound as you strip down to the smaller radii, because it is conserving that central density. But extrapolating that down to radius of 0 isn't really a very reasonable thing to do, I would say. So in the case that the density does go to infinity as you go to the center, then yes, it does predict that there will always be something bound.
But I thought you were advocating a model where you're basically cutting down things by energy.
Yeah.
And in energy, there is a finite energy. There's a maximum bound energy in an NFW profile because escape velocities is finite at the center. So if I were to take your model, forwards, basically it will eventually cut off to 0, right? I guess I understand your argument about density, but density is not a relevant parameter here. It's more the energy, if I understand.
Yeah, so you are absolutely correct. So I was more talking about the mass loss model here, which is, this kind of idea that if you just do this sort of cut where you're going down to a tidal radius and then seeing what the bound mass is and then recalculating a density profile based on that. So in that case, you're never going to get down to as far of a cut in energy as you would need to get. So this model alone, yes, you could absolutely get complete disruption. But then here, if you're always cutting down to, this density of the host and then the density of the satellites preserved to be.
Okay, no, I understand, but that's sort of an ansatz, right? It's not to
I don't.
By by any physics. You're just saying, let's assume
Exactly.
that this is the mass loss rate and let's see where it takes us. Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this does come out of like physical modeling, but again, extrapolating the profile down, yeah, is not probably reasonable.
That's fine. That's all. Thanks.
All right, any other questions for our speaker? Feel free to type them in the chat if you don't wish to speak out loud. While we're waiting for more questions, I have a question. As a pretty extreme cluster observationalist, what physical parameters are you hoping, or what physical measurements are you hoping that us cluster people will find in order to constrain these models further? Do you need better masses? Do you need better temperatures, shapes? What is it that these models need on the observational end?
So probably the best proxy for age is concentration, which is difficult to measure. And that again, you need the masses too, because you need to know how many clusters there are of a certain mass at a certain concentration. We did do some kind of rough calculations with cosmological simulations before, though, and we thought that it would probably make more sense actually to use shape. So just like really a lot of measurements of the projected shape of clusters, and then enough that you could average them out and then compare to simulations as what the average shape should be. So really, we just need a lot of measurements.
Okay, so yeah, we need wider areas, and well, let's see. Are you looking? Would the models be best be better constrained by looking at higher redshift as well clusters, or do we want more detail for things that are closer to us?
So this is mostly thinking about low redshift clusters. I'm not sure if you was on this call. I can't remember exactly what cluster range we talked about in that paper, but I think it was around like 0.3 or we're mostly looking at low redshift things.
Okay. Well, that's good news for myself. Let's see, I could come up with more questions, but does anybody want to ask another question before we get further into it? Julio, I believe you had more questions if you wanted. Feel free.
I think you're muted.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I forgot to unraise my hand. I think I'm fine with Nicole's response. So
Okay.
I think James had a question.
Yes, I see that. James, feel free to ask.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about with Roman in particular, how much information do you get about galaxy luminosity functions around reionization? I mean, is it going to be enough, do you think, to resolve sort of questions of when and how it happens in the mass scale?
Yeah, so I maybe have a plot in my extra plots, but so that is one thing we looked at specifically for a one. How do I go back? Sorry. Yeah, so we specifically looked at a 1 degree square field of view, which would be 3 pointings with Roman. There's not actually an ultra deep field planned yet, so it partially depends on that. But based on our, there we go. So based on our simulations, these would be our luminosity function constraints. So in black, these are the best compiled constraints there are right now. And I've written on here how many galaxies there are in those constraints. So if you get up to redshift 7 till 10, there's like 600 observations in these black points, where if you get up to redshift 10, there's only 8 observations, where a 1 degree square field of view will have like 2 orders of magnitude more observations at pretty much all redshifts. So you're going to get very small error bars. So it's not going to go out much fainter than the previous measurements, but the constraints on the shape of the luminosity function will be very small.
Thanks.
We have time for a few more questions if anybody has any. Let's see, I have other questions while other people think. I was looking at slide 28, where you start talking about these galaxy models that you're making. This is just another weird observationalist question. But how are you deciding what morphological models to put into this? Is there a paper that you're using, or how does this change with redshift as well?
Okay, so for Sursic index and the projected shape on the sky, used distributions from a paper by Christina Williams, who did a very similar modeling for JWST, and those were based on HST observations. For the galaxy sizes, I used constraints just from redshift 0 in the literature, and then extrapolated back to high redshifts, and then with the kind of showed with it actually matches observations very, very well. Just you get the right redshift trends just from the way that the virial radius evolves at higher redshift.
Oh, fantastic. Sounds like an observational stream so far. All right, we have a few more minutes. If anybody wants to step in, I'd rather not dominate the conversation. Let's see, anybody else? Well, if not, it is getting somewhat close to 4. Let's see, what else? Last few chances in a couple of minutes. Otherwise, let's see, I'll look over my notes. I think that's about all the questions I wrote down. Yeah, if that's last chance, anybody? All right, fantastic. Then thank you so much, Dr. Drakos. Very nice of y'all to show up. The Canvas talks really showcase the wonderful work that Canadian astronomers do. They produce an enormous amount of published papers, so it's important to showcase the work of postdocs. So thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us, Nicole. And our next talk will be, let me look up in my notes, December, I have this somewhere. No.
November 25th, I think.
November 25th, yes, with Keir Rogers. Again, thank you everybody for coming, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Leo.